My name is Juan, and I've been driving trucks across this country for over 20 years. I've seen it all in this job: accidents, animals crossing the road, and even some robberies. But what happened to me that night is something I'll never be able to erase from my memory. It was a normal route, at least at first. I was heading north, transporting a load of cement. The road was quiet, with a clear sky and the stars keeping me company. I had left late to avoid traffic, so the highway was practically empty. Only the roar of the engine and the faint whistle of the wind broke the silence. I had been driving for several hours when, suddenly, I saw it. A truck parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. It wasn't unusual to find broken-down vehicles in that area, so I didn't think much of it at first. However, as I got closer, something caught my attention. The truck was old, rusted, as if it had been abandoned for years. But the strange thing was that screams were coming from inside. At first, I thought it was an argument. It could have been two drivers fighting, or maybe someone calling for help. I slowed down and approached cautiously, turning on my high beams to see better. "Everything okay?" I shouted from my cabin, hoping someone would respond. But the screams continued. They were heart-wrenching, as if someone were in agony. The strangest part was that I couldn't make out any words, just high-pitched sounds filled with desperation. I turned off the engine and got out with a flashlight in hand. Something inside me told me I shouldn't get closer, but common sense compelled me to. What if someone was in danger? I approached the trailer with slow steps, feeling every muscle in my body tense up. The rear doors of the container were locked with an old, rusted padlock, but the screams were coming from inside, as if someone were trapped there. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked, trying to stay calm. At that moment, the screams stopped. An absolute silence fell over the road. The wind ceased, and for a moment, it felt as if everything around me had stopped existing. My breathing became heavy, and I moved closer to the container. When I shone the flashlight on the padlock, I noticed it was covered in a reddish substance, like rust or something else. Just as I was about to step back, I heard a bang from inside. A loud bang, as if someone were kicking the doors with all their strength. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my temples. "Let me out," a voice shouted from inside, this time clear and human. My instinct told me I should help, but something didn't add up. How could someone be trapped if the truck seemed abandoned? And then I saw it. A face. It appeared suddenly through one of the small gaps in the container, pressed against the metal. It was a pale face, with eyes as black as the abyss. It didn't say anything, just stared at me, and the expression on its face was a mix of desperation and something I can't describe, something inhuman. I dropped the flashlight in fright and ran back to my truck without looking back. I started the engine and sped off, leaving the truck and its screams behind. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station a few kilometers ahead. I got out of the truck with trembling legs and told the store clerk what I had seen. He looked at me with a pale face, and then, as if he knew exactly what I was talking about, he said in a low voice, "That truck, it's been there for years. No one goes near it. And those who do say they hear things. Since that day, I avoid that road at all costs. But sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, when everything is silent, I can still hear those screams in my mind. And the worst part is, I feel that sooner or later, I'll hear them again." Next story. My name is Hank, and I've been driving a trailer along the icy roads of Alaska for over 10 years. Here, loneliness and cold are constant companions, but you also learn to fear the unknown. That particular night, I discovered that there are things in these lands that shouldn't exist. I had left Fairbanks late with a load of frozen food, heading to a small town up north. It was the middle of winter, and the road was covered in snow. My chains screeched against the ice, and the steam from my breath fogged up the cabin. The trailer's lights barely illuminated a few meters ahead. Everything else was absolute darkness. Around midnight, after about 4 hours of driving, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. At first glance, it looked like a dark shape on the road, something moving slowly. I didn't pay much attention at first, thinking it might be a moose or perhaps a wolf. But as I kept going, I realized that whatever it was following my trailer. I sped up a little, but the shape was still there, moving at an impossible speed for a normal animal. I turned on the rear lights, hoping to scare it away. For a moment, the creature was illuminated, and what I saw froze me in place. It was tall, much larger than a bear, and its body seemed thin and elongated, covered in dark, tangled fur. But what disturbed me the most were its eyes, two glowing points, like embers, that seemed to pierce through the night. Its shape was vaguely human, but there was something about its movement that was unnatural, as if it didn't fully belong to this world. I pressed the accelerator. The trailer roared, and the speed increased, but when I looked in the mirror again, the creature was still there, keeping pace. Its gait was irregular, almost as if it were limping, but it didn't slow down. My breathing grew heavy, and I felt cold sweat on my back despite the freezing weather. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't ignore the presence of that thing behind me. Every now and then, I'd turn my head to look, and there it was, like a cursed shadow that refused to disappear. The kilometers passed slowly, and the creature didn't stop. At one point, it started getting closer, close enough for me to hear a strange sound, a low moan, like a lament that vibrated in the air. I turned on the radio to distract myself, but all I got was static. The numbers on the dashboard clock seemed frozen, stuck at 1:15 for what felt like an eternity. It was as if time itself had stopped. When the dawn began to tint the horizon with a faint blue light, I felt a glimmer of hope. I glanced at the rearview mirror once more, and this time, the creature had stopped. It stood still in the middle of the road, watching me. Despite the distance, I felt its gaze piercing through me, and something inside told me I shouldn't stop. I kept driving until the sun was fully up in the sky. Only then did I dare to stop at a gas station. I got out of the trailer with trembling legs, lit a cigarette, and stood there watching the road I had come from, hoping I wouldn't see that thing again. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? But now, every time I drive along those lonely, icy roads, I can't help but constantly check the rearview mirror, fearing that those glowing eyes might reappear in the darkness. Next story. I've always considered myself a man of few superstitions. I've been driving a trailer across the country for over 15 years, and though I've heard many stories from my fellow drivers about strange things on the road, I never paid them much attention. But that night, something changed. I had taken a night trip heading south, transporting a load of heavy machinery. The road was deserted, the sky covered in thick clouds, and I could barely see beyond the beam of my headlights. I felt strangely uneasy, though I didn't know why. The constant roar of the engine was my only company until a bright sign on the side of the road forced me to slow down. Dieter. Roadwork ahead. I sighed and followed the arrows pointing to an alternate route. It was a secondary road, narrow and surrounded by a forest so dense it seemed to swallow the light from my headlights. After a few kilometers, the feeling of discomfort grew. I turned on the radio to distract myself, but all I got was unsettling static. I turned it off, cursing under my breath. That's when I saw her. On the side of the road, under the dim light of my headlights, I made out the figure of a woman. She was standing motionless, wearing what looked like an old, almost tattered white dress. Her long, dark hair covered part of her face. For a moment, I thought about stopping to offer help, but something about her made me hesitate. I don't know if it was her rigid posture or the fact that she didn't seem to move at all. She was just there watching me. I drove past her, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I felt my stomach drop. The woman was still there, but now she was standing in the middle of the road, closer than she should have been, as if she had moved without me seeing her. I accelerated. It's just fatigue, I told myself, trying to calm down. I've been driving too many hours straight, but that explanation didn't fully reassure me. A few minutes later, the road began to fill with fog. It was so thick I could barely see a few meters ahead. As I drove on, I had to slow down, and that's when something happened that made me question my sanity. Out of the fog emerged something. An old building, a rundown motel with a flickering neon sign that read "Welcome." I didn't remember seeing it before, especially not on this route. I parked the trailer on the side of the road, determined to ask if I could use the restroom or grab a coffee to clear my head. The place was completely silent, too silent for a motel. The main door was slightly ajar, and when I entered, I noticed the interior seemed abandoned. The tables in the small restaurant were covered in dust, and a clock on the wall read 3:33, though it seemed to be stuck. I called out a couple of times, but no one answered. I was about to head back to the trailer when I heard a sound. A whisper. It came from somewhere in the back, where several room doors lined the hallway. "Hello," I said, trying to sound firm. The whisper stopped, and for a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then, the door at the very end of the hallway slowly opened, as if inviting me in. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold sweat run down my back. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but there was something about that open door that drew me in. An irrational curiosity, mixed with a fear that paralyzed me. I walked slowly down the hallway, my boots echoing on the worn wooden floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the open door, I stopped and looked inside. It was a small, gloomy room, lit only by the flickering light of a lamp that seemed on the verge of burning out. In the center of the room was a chair, and on it, an old, tattered doll with glass eyes that seemed to follow me. The whisper returned, louder this time, though I couldn't make out the words. It was coming from behind me. I turned around sharply, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway. I felt my skin crawl as the whisper turned into laughter, soft at first but growing louder, echoing throughout the building. Without thinking twice, I ran for the exit, my footsteps pounding like drums in the silence of the motel. When I stepped outside, the fog was even thicker, but the trailer's engine was running. I didn't remember leaving it on. I jumped into the cabin, slamming the door shut, and put the vehicle in gear. I sped down the road without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog began to dissipate little by little, and the road returned to its normal appearance. I forced myself to breathe calmly and tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. However, when I checked the dashboard clock, a chill ran through my body. It was 3:33, the same time the motel clock had shown. I reached my destination at dawn, without seeing anything strange again. But as I unloaded the trailer, I noticed something that made my hands tremble. On the floor of the cabin, right where I had placed my backpack, was the doll from the room. Its cracked porcelain face seemed to smile at me, as if it knew something I didn't. Since that night, I've never taken a nighttime detour again. And though I try to forget, every time I see a clock showing 3:33, a shiver reminds me that there are things on the road that are better left unexplored. Next story. I had never picked up anyone on the road before. It's a rule we truckers have, don't trust strangers. But that night, something in me broke that rule. I was driving down a secondary road heading north. It was a route I often took to avoid the heavy traffic on the main highway. Everything was calm, except for the roar of the engine and the swaying of the trees along the roadside, moved by a cold wind that seemed to signal an approaching storm. That's when I saw her. A young woman was standing on the side of the road, right where the headlights illuminated the asphalt. She was wearing a light dress that reached her knees and had a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Her brown hair fell messily over her face, and she raised her hand, asking for a ride. My first instinct was to keep driving. It wasn't my problem, I thought. But as I drove away, something made me stop. Maybe it was the fact that we were in the middle of nowhere, with no nearby towns. Or maybe it was the way she looked at me, as if she had no other option in the world. I slowly reversed the trailer until I was next to her. I rolled down the passenger window. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound tougher than I felt. "As far as you can take me," she replied, her voice soft but strangely calm for someone in her situation. I hesitated for a moment but finally gestured for her to get in. There was nothing about her appearance that seemed threatening, and the cold outside was intense. She climbed in slowly, closing the door behind her. Her backpack fell at her feet, and she sat in silence, staring straight ahead. For a while, neither of us said anything. Only the engine filled the void between us. "Traveling alone?" I asked, more to break the silence than out of genuine curiosity. "Yes. Family? Friends? Anyone I can let know you're okay?" She turned her head toward me. Her eyes were deep, dark, as if hiding something she didn't want to share. "There's no one." Her answer unsettled me. Something in her tone was cold, almost empty. I decided not to push further. We drove on for a good while. Every now and then, I tried to start a conversation, but she responded with monosyllables or changed the subject. She didn't seem scared or lost, but there was something about her demeanor that didn't add up. Finally, she broke the silence. "Thanks for stopping." "Not everyone would." "It's nothing," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Oh, it's more than you think," she said, her tone sending chills down my spine. Something in her voice made me glance sideways. She was smiling, but it wasn't a smile of gratitude. It was different. Before I could respond, she pointed ahead. "Can you stop here?" I looked where she was pointing. It was a turnoff leading to a dirt road, completely dark. "Here?" I asked, confused. "Yes. I've arrived." My instincts screamed at me not to do it, but my hand was already slowing the trailer down. I stopped on the side of the road, right in front of the turnoff. She opened the door, grabbed her backpack, and got out without another word. Before closing the door, she turned to me. "Thanks, Jorge." My heart stopped. I had never told her my name. I wanted to ask her how she knew, but she had already disappeared into the darkness. I sat frozen for several seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, I decided to keep going. I drove a few more kilometers, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned the trailer around at a gas station and headed back to where I had dropped her off. When I reached the turnoff, the road was blocked by a rusted fence and a half-fallen sign read, "No entry. Abandoned area." My skin crawled. There was no way anyone could have gone in there. I accelerated without looking back, swearing to myself that I would never stop on the road for anyone again. That night, as I tried to sleep at a truck stop, something woke me. It was a whisper, a familiar voice. "Thanks, Jorge." And ever since, every time I drive alone, I feel like someone is sitting in the passenger seat. Next story. My name is Martin, and I've been driving the roads of Mexico in my trailer for over 15 years. I'm used to the long hours of solitude, the endless nights, and the silence broken only by the roar of the engine or the music on the radio. But what I experienced one night on a lonely stretch of the Sierra Madre is something I'll never forget. I had left Monterrey heading to Mexico City. The route was familiar but always demanding. Sharp curves, thick fog, and the constant danger of bandits. It was already past midnight when I decided to turn on the radio to stay awake. I always tuned into a local station playing norteño music, something to help me stay alert and connected to the road. At first, everything was normal. One song after another, interrupted by the usual commercials. But suddenly, the signal began to fail. First, it was a faint buzz, like static, which quickly turned into a deeper noise, as if something were scratching inside the speakers. "Damn thing," I muttered, gently hitting the console to see if it would fix itself. Instead of improving, the noise turned into something that chilled my blood: voices. They weren't normal voices. They were deep, guttural, as if coming from somewhere very far away or very close. At first, I thought it was interference, maybe some alternative radio program I had accidentally tuned into. But the words made no sense. They were like a strange language, full of inhuman sounds, mixed with screams and moans that seemed to come from an endless cavern. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned down the volume, but the voices were still there, barely audible, like a constant murmur that seemed to surround me. Then, among all those incomprehensible words, I heard something clear, something I recognized. My name. The steering wheel slipped from my hands for a second, and the trailer swerved slightly. I steadied it immediately, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Had I heard correctly? Was it my imagination? I turned up the volume to confirm, and there it was again. "Martin, why don't you stop?" The tone was slow, drawn out, and seemed to mock me. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, as if something invisible were pressing on my chest. My hands were so cold I could barely hold the wheel. "Who's there?" I shouted, like a fool, expecting a response that never came. Instead, the voices began to laugh. It was a twisted laughter, as if many throats were laughing in unison, echoing inside the cabin. The trailer started to vibrate, as if something heavier than the cargo were on top of it. "This isn't real," I repeated to myself, trying to convince myself. I turned off the radio with a slap, but the voices didn't disappear. Now I could hear them clearly as if they were right behind me. That's when I felt it, a presence. Something was in the cabin with me. I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart in my throat, but I saw nothing. Yet the cold was intense, and my breath came out in small clouds of vapor. The laughter stopped abruptly, and in its place, I heard a whisper. "We're waiting for you, at the curve." I slammed on the accelerator. I didn't know what that was, but all I wanted was to get away as fast as possible. The engine roared, and the trailer's lights illuminated the road full of curves and fog. I reached a particularly sharp curve, one I knew well because many accidents happen there. As I was about to take it, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes with all my strength. An overturned trailer, its cabin crushed and its lights still on. My trailer stopped just a few meters from the wreck. I got out, trembling, to see if there were any survivors, but what I found left me frozen. The overturned trailer was identical to mine. The same cabin, the same license plate, even the company logo. And there, among the wreckage, I saw something I'll never forget, a body trapped in the twisted metal. It was me. The voices returned, this time louder, surrounding me completely. "We told you, no one escapes their fate." I don't remember how I got back into the trailer or how I made it to the next town. Since that night, I never turn on the radio on the road. And though I try to convince myself it was just a nightmare, every time I pass that stretch, I feel like something is waiting for me at the curve. Only this time, I don't plan to stop.